The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, the kind that presses against your eardrums right before a storm breaks. Mark stood in the center of the walk-in closet, staring at the empty hangers where his wife's designer coats used to hang, while the glowing screen of his iPad on the bed displayed a bank balance of exactly 0.00. It wasn't just a robbery. It was an erasure of their past and their son's future, executed with surgical precision by the woman he slept next to every night. If the anatomy of a betrayal this cold fascinates you, stay with me as we peel back the layers of this fractured life. The blue light of the laptop screen was the only thing illuminating the study, casting long, spectral shadows against the mahogany bookshelves. Mark sat motionless, his hand hovering over the trackpad. His eyes burning from the dryness of not blinking, he clicked refresh. The numbers didn't change. Godzazuro. It had to be a glitch, a server error, a banking interface update gone wrong. He closed the browser, cleared his cache, his fingers trembling slightly, and logged back in. The interface loaded with agonizing slowness, the spinning wheel mocking his rising panic. When the dashboard reappeared, the Leo Contisionco College Fund account was still there, but the balance remained a hollow, perfect zero. Mark pushed his chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the floorboards. The sound echoed through the silent house, amplifying the sudden feeling of isolation. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The house in Queen Anne was still, the rain outside tapping a relentless, rhythmic code against the window pane. He stood up and walked out of the study, his socks sliding on the polished hardwood of the hallway. He needed to wake Elena. She handled the transfers sometimes. Maybe she had moved it to a higher-yield trust they had discussed months ago. Yes, that was it. She was being proactive. He was panicking over good financial management. He pushed open the door to the master bedroom. The streetlights from below filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating the king-sized bed. It was made. Not just made, pristine. The duvet was pulled taut, the pillows arranged with decorative precision. No indentation of a body, no warmth. Mark walked to the ensuite bathroom, dry sink, no smell of her lavender night cream. He turned to the walk-in closet. He didn't need to turn on the light to feel the change in air pressure, the lack of acoustic absorption that comes from a space filled with fabric. He flicked the switch. Her side of the closet was a gaping mouth. The hangers were there, wire skeletons jangling slightly from the draft of the door opening. Her coats, her dresses, the shoeboxes that usually stacked to the ceiling, gone. He felt the bile rise in his throat, hot and acidic. He stumbled back into the bedroom, his mind racing to catch up with his eyes. This wasn't a transfer of funds. This was an evacuation. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand. 3 missed calls from an unknown number earlier in the day. No texts from her. He dialed her number. It didn't even ring. It went straight to the operator message stating the line had been disconnected. "Think, Mark, think," he whispered, clutching his hair. He rushed downstairs, checking the safe behind the painting in the living room. Open, empty, the emergency cash. The passports, gone. He leaned against the cold wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. The realization hit him not as a wave, but as a physical blow to the gut. The money was for Leo. It was 12 years of bonuses, of skipped vacations, of safe investments. It was the promise that his son wouldn't start life with debt. She hadn't just left him. She had looted their child's future. And she hadn't done it alone. The thought of the heavy luggage, the logistics, someone helped her. A floorboard creaked above him. Mark froze. He wiped his face aggressively, trying to scrub away the terror before looking up toward the staircase. Leo stood at the top of the stairs. At 10 years old, he was small for his age, wearing his oversized spaceship pajamas, clutching the wooden banister. In the shadows, his eyes looked huge, dark pools reflecting the ambient light from the foyer. Mark forced a smile, his voice cracking. "Hey, buddy. Did I wake you? Just doing some work. Everything's fine." Leo didn't move. He didn't ask where Mom was. He didn't ask why Mark was sitting on the floor in the dark. He just watched, with a terrifying, adult-like stillness. "Leo, go back to bed," Mark said, standing up on shaky legs, trying to project authority. "Mom's she had to go on a trip. Early flight." Leo took a step down, then another. He stopped halfway down the stairs, looking directly at his father. "She's not on a trip, Dad," Leo said. His voice was steady, devoid of the confusion a child should have felt. Mark froze. "What?" "She took the silver key," Leo said softly. "The one for the safe. I saw her give it to the man in the car yesterday." Mark gripped the banister, his knuckles turning white. The hallway air felt thin, insufficient to fill his lungs. He looked up at his son, expecting to see fear or confusion, the natural reaction of a 10-year-old realizing his mother was gone. Instead, he saw a flat, mirrored surface. Leo wasn't trembling. He was waiting. "A man in the car?" Mark repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He moved up the stairs, one heavy step at a time, until he was eye level with the boy. "Leo, this is important. Who was the man? Did you know him?" Leo looked past his father's shoulder, staring at the empty space where the family portraits hung in the foyer. "He had paint on his hands," Leo said simply. "Blue paint, like the sky." The detail was so specific, so casual, that it made Mark's stomach turn. He reached out, placing a hand on Leo's small shoulder. The boy didn't flinch, but he didn't lean into the touch either. He stood there like a statue. "Okay," Mark said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Okay. We'll talk about this in the morning. You need to sleep." "She said not to wait up," Leo added. He turned around and walked back to his room, his footsteps silent on the carpet. He closed the door with a soft click. No tears. No questions about when she would be back. Just compliance. Mark stood in the hallway for a long time, the silence of the house pressing against his ears. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with the things Leo wasn't saying. His son had been coached. The realization made Mark want to scream, but he swallowed the sound, tasting bitter bile. He needed to move. He couldn't stay in the house with the ghosts of her clothes and the empty safe. He went down to the garage. The air in the garage was stagnant, smelling of concrete and old gasoline. Elena's white Audi was parked in its usual spot. She hadn't taken it. Of course. She wouldn't want the GPS tracker pinging her location. She had left in the man's car. Mark walked around the vehicle. It looked innocent, a remnant of their suburban legitimacy. He opened the passenger door. The interior smelled of her perfume, vanilla and something sharper, like expensive leather. It was a sensory assault that made his knees weak. He began to tear through the car. He opened the glove compartment, scattering registration papers and insurance cards. He checked under the mats. He reached into the gap between the center console and the seat. His fingers brushed against cold plastic. He pulled it out. It was a phone. Not her sleek iPhone, but a cheap, prepaid burner model with a cracked screen. The battery was dead. Mark ran back into the house, his hands shaking as he rummaged through the kitchen junk drawer for a universal charger. He found a cable, plugged it into the kitchen island outlet, and waited. The screen flickered to life with a generic startup logo. There was no passcode. He opened the messages. There was only one thread, labeled simply, J. Mark leaves for the firm at 8 kyo. You have the window then. Don't worry about L. He understands. He wants us to be happy. Mark read the last message again, the glowing text blurring before his eyes. He wants us to be happy. She had convinced their son that robbing his own father was an act of benevolence. Mark scrolled up. The account clears on Tuesday. Bring the car round the back. I'll miss the studio, but the light is better down south. Studio. Paint on his hands. The image clicked into place with sickening clarity. Julian. The struggling landscape artist Elena had hired to commission a piece for the lobby of Mark's firm last year. The man Mark had invited to dinner. The man he had pitied for his frayed cuffs and desperate eagerness. Mark had thought Julian was looking for a patron. He hadn't realized Julian was scouting a victim. Mark looked at the timestamp of the last message. It was sent 4 hours ago. He dropped the phone on the granite counter. The noise was like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. Upstairs, Leo was sleeping, or pretending to. Mark looked at the ceiling, imagining his son lying in the dark, clutching the secret he had been groomed to keep. The betrayal wasn't just the money. Elena hadn't just stolen his savings. She had stolen his son's conscience. Mark picked up the burner phone again. He didn't call the police. Not yet. The police would call it a domestic dispute. They would say it was a civil matter. He opened his laptop and typed Julian Vane into the search bar. The face that stared back was handsome in a disheveled way, smiling in front of a mediocre seascape. Mark stared at the eyes of the man who had destroyed his life, and for the first time that night, the panic subsided, replaced by a cold, hard rage. He wasn't going to just file a report. He was going to hunt them down. Seattle was a city built on glass, transparent, reflective, and unforgiving. Mark felt this acutely as he walked into the lobby of his architecture firm on Thursday morning. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah who usually greeted him with a bright update on the weather, kept her eyes fixed on her monitor. Her typing was too rhythmic, too performative. She knew. Mark walked past the glass-walled conference room. Inside, 2 junior associates stopped talking the moment he came into view. They didn't look at him. They looked at their papers, their coffee cups, the gray sky outside. Anywhere but at the man whose wife had staged the most expensive exit in the neighborhood's history. He reached his office and closed the door, leaning his forehead against the cool wood. The isolation he felt at home was terrifying, but this public isolation was humiliating. It was a social quarantine. His phone buzzed. It wasn't a client. It was a notification from his credit card company. Transaction declined, Whole Foods Market, 40-50s. He stared at the screen. He hadn't been to Whole Foods. It was an auto-pay for a subscription or a recurring delivery. He logged into the banking portal, the same one that had shown him the zero balance 2 nights ago. He clicked on the Liabilities tab, a section he rarely checked because they paid their balances in full every month. The number that stared back at him made his breath hitch. Current balance, $48,000, limit reached. She hadn't just taken the cash. In the weeks leading up to her departure, Elena had maxed out the joint American Express. He scrolled through the transactions. Cash advances. Luxury boutiques in San Francisco. A rental deposit on a property in Big Sur under a generic LLC name. She had financed her escape on credit, leaving him to hold the debt. A knock on the door made him jump. "Mark?" It was David, the senior partner. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped in, closing the door behind him with a softness that signaled bad news. "Do you have a minute?" "I'm preparing the Hudson sketches," Mark lied, moving papers around his desk aimlessly. David sat on the edge of the desk, invading Mark's space. "Look, we're hearing things. About Elena. About the accounts." Mark stiffened. "It's a misunderstanding, David. A banking error. Elena is visiting her mother." David's expression was pitying, which was worse than anger. "The bank called the firm, Mark. They were verifying employment for a loan modification application submitted 3 weeks ago. By Elena. She forged your signature." The room spun. A loan modification. She had tried to leverage the house, too. "I need to go," Mark said, standing up abruptly. He couldn't breathe in here. He left the office, ignoring David's calls, and got into his car. He drove aimlessly for an hour before heading to Leo's school. He was early for pickup, but he couldn't go back to the empty house yet. The pickup line at St. Jude's was a parade of Range Rovers and Teslas. Mark parked his sedan and waited. When the bell rang, the children flooded out in their navy blazers. He saw Leo immediately. The boy was walking alone, a few feet behind a group of laughing classmates. Mark got out of the car. He saw 2 mothers standing by the gate. Women who had attended his summer barbecue. Women who had toasted to his promotion. As he approached, their conversation died instantly. One of them checked her watch. The other suddenly found something fascinating on her phone. They moved aside as if his misfortune was contagious. Leo reached the car, throwing his backpack into the back seat with a dull thud. He climbed in without a word. "How was school?" Mark asked, starting the engine. He sounded desperate even to himself. "Fine," Leo said, staring out the window. "Did anyone say anything?" Leo turned to look at him. The boy's eyes were old, tired. "Jason said his mom told him we're going to be poor now. He asked if I have to move to public school." Mark gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. The anger that had fueled him the night before was being replaced by a crushing sense of impotence. He wasn't just losing his money. He was losing his standing, his respect, and his ability to protect his son from the cruelty of their world. "We aren't poor, Leo," Mark lied, his voice tight. "And you aren't going anywhere." But as he drove past the manicured lawns of his neighborhood, Mark knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The house wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a crime scene, and the mortgage was due in 6 days. The pizza box sat open on the coffee table, the grease staining the cardboard in a slow, widening circle. It was a cheap pepperoni from a place 2 blocks away, a stark contrast to the organic, home-cooked meals Elena used to orchestrate with military precision. Mark sat on the sofa, a slice untouched in his hand. Leo sat on the floor, his back against the armchair, chewing with a rhythmic, mechanical jaw movement that unnerved Mark. The house felt too big tonight. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of the day's humiliations, the pitying looks at the office, the whisper of poor in the schoolyard. "You don't have to listen to them, Leo," Mark said, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "What Jason said, it's complicated. But we aren't finished." Leo didn't look up. He traced the pattern of the Persian rug with his finger. "Mom liked this rug," he said softly. "She said it was the only thing with color in the whole house." Mark felt a flash of irritation. Mom isn't here, Leo. I know. Mark put the pizza down. He couldn't do this anymore. The dancing around the truth, the protective buffer he was trying to maintain. He needed to understand the anatomy of that Tuesday night. He needed to know how a 10-year-old boy could watch his mother dismantle their life and not utter a sound. Leo, Mark said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. I need you to tell me about Tuesday. Real talk, no secrets. Leo's hand stopped moving on the rug. He stiffened. You said you saw the key, Mark pressed, his voice trembling slightly. You said you saw the man with the paint. That means you were awake. You were watching. I was thirsty, Leo whispered. Did she see you? Leo nodded slowly. She came out of the office. She had the big bag, the black one. Mark closed his eyes. The black duffel bag, the one he used for gym gear. She had stuffed $200,000 worth of their life into his gym bag. And she saw you, Mark repeated. Did she say anything? Leo finally looked up. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, balancing on that precarious edge between childhood innocence and adult burden. She knelt down. She smelled like rain. What did she say, Leo? Mark asked. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Leo took a breath, a small, shallow gasp. She told me to go back to bed. She said she had to go save herself. Save herself? Mark let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. From what? From us. From you, Leo said. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence. Mark recoiled as if he had been slapped. What? Leo's eyes were dry, but they were burning with a borrowed conviction. Elena's conviction. She said you were a machine, Dad. She said you only cared about the numbers in the bank and the grades on my report card. She said... Leo paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded terrifyingly like his mother's. What did she say? Mark whispered, dread pooling in his stomach. She said, If you love me, Leo, you'll stay quiet. If you wake him up, he'll lock me in this house forever. Do you want Mommy to die in this house? Mark stared at his son, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't just theft. It was assassination. She had murdered his character in the eyes of their son before she even walked out the door. She had weaponized the boy's love, turning Mark into the jailer and herself into the prisoner escaping a death sentence. I didn't want her to die, Leo said, his voice breaking for the first time. So I went back to bed. I waited for the car to drive away. Mark looked at the boy, this small, fragile witness to his ruin. Leo hadn't been an accomplice out of malice. He had been a hostage to a narrative Mark hadn't even known was being written. The college fund wasn't just money to Elena. It was the ransom she felt she was owed. Mark reached out, but his hand froze in midair. He realized with a sickening clarity that every time he looked at Leo now, he wouldn't just see his son. He would see the boy who chose to let her go. He would see the boy who believed, even for a second, that his father was a monster. She lied to you, Leo, Mark said, his voice hollow. Did she? Leo asked, looking around the dark, oppressive living room. You look really scary right now, Dad. Mark pulled his hand back. The distance between the sofa and the floor felt like a canyon. The office of Elias Vance did not look like it belonged in a noir film. It was sterile, brightly lit, and smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. It was located in a shared workspace building in South Lake Union, surrounded by tech startups and optimistic freelancers. Mark sat across from Vance, a man who looked more like a tired accountant than a hunter of missing persons. "You're sure it's them?" Mark asked. His voice was hoarse. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since the pizza dinner with Leo. Vance didn't answer immediately. He slid a thick manila envelope across the glass table. The sound of the paper friction was the only noise in the room. "People think they want to disappear," Vance said, his tone bored, clinical. "But they don't. They want to be seen disappearing, especially when they feel they've been invisible for a long time." Mark opened the envelope. Inside were high-resolution photographs, taken with a telephoto lens. The first photo hit him like a physical blow. It was sunny, blindly, aggressively sunny. A stark contrast to the gray drizzle streaking the window behind Mark. The location was unmistakably California. The rugged coastline, the cypress trees, the golden light. "Carmel by the sea," Vance said. "Rented a cottage 3 blocks from the beach. Paid 6 months in advance. Cash." Mark shuffled the photos. There was Elena. She was wearing a white linen dress he had never seen before. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a glass of white wine in her hand. She looked younger. She looked lighter. She looked like a woman who hadn't just orphaned her child and bankrupted her husband. And there was Julian. He was setting up an easel on a deck overlooking the ocean. He was painting. Mark stared at the easel in the photo. He calculated the cost of the rental, the wine, the linen dress, the easel, the paints. "That's Leo's tuition," Mark whispered. He pointed a trembling finger at the wine glass in Elena's hand. "That glass of Chardonnay, that's a semester of textbooks. That rental cottage, that's his freshman year dorm." It wasn't just that she had stolen the money. It was what she was trading it for. She wasn't saving a life. She was buying a fantasy. She was burning his son's future to fuel a midlife bohemian cosplay with a mediocre artist. "They aren't hiding," Mark said, the realization hardening the soft edges of his grief into something sharp and dangerous. "No," Vance agreed. "They're living, and they're burning through cash fast. That cottage is 10 grand a month. The lifestyle, give it 5 months, maybe 6. The money will be gone." Mark looked up from the photos. The image of Leo sitting on the rug, claiming he didn't want his mother to die, flashed in his mind. Elena wasn't dying. She was thriving on the marrow of their family's bones. "I don't want to just find them," Mark said. The tremor in his hand stopped. He felt a sudden, icy clarity. "I want to freeze them." "I can give you the address," Vance said. "What you do with it is up to your lawyer. But Mr. Anderson, legal battles across state lines, they get expensive. You sure you have the capital for a war of attrition?" Mark looked at the photo of Julian, the paint on his hands, the blue like the sky that Leo had noticed. Julian was painting the view that Mark had paid for. "I don't care about the cost anymore," Mark said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He picked up the envelope. He needed to show these to his lawyer. He needed to file emergency injunctions. He needed to ensure that when the money ran out, and it would, Elena would have no lifeboat waiting for her. "Send me the bill," Mark said. "Already sent," Vance replied, tapping his keyboard. Mark walked out into the Seattle rain. He clutched the envelope against his chest to keep it dry. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the architect, and he was about to design their collapse. The Seattle rain had returned, washing away the memory of the dry summer, just as the reality of the last 6 months had washed away the soft edges of Mark's former life. The house was quieter now. The expensive Persian rug, the one Leo had liked, was gone. sold to pay off the credit card debt Elena had left behind. In its place was a bare hardwood floor that creaked under Mark's feet as he walked to the kitchen to rinse his coffee mug. It was a Tuesday again. The irony wasn't lost on him. At 9:15 p.m., the doorbell rang. It wasn't a delivery. He wasn't expecting anyone. Leo was asleep upstairs, finally settling into a routine that didn't involve checking the window every 10 minutes. Mark wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked to the foyer. He turned on the porch light and peered through the peephole. For a moment, he didn't recognize the figure standing in the downpour. He unlocked the door and opened it, not out of welcome, but out of shock. Elena stood there. The woman from the photographs, the sun-drenched muse in white linen, was gone. In her place was a shivering figure wrapped in a coat that looked too thin for November in the Pacific Northwest. Her hair, usually a pristine blonde curtain, was dark at the roots and plastered to her skull. She held a single, small suitcase. "Mark," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual melodic confidence. Mark didn't move. He stood in the doorway, his body forming a barrier between the damp night and the warmth of the hall. "Where is he?" Elena looked down at her boots. They were scuffed, muddy. "He left," she whispered. "In Santa Barbara. He took the car. He said the inspiration was gone." "The money," Mark corrected coldly. "He said the money was gone." She looked up then, her eyes swimming with tears that Mark might have once found devastating. Now they just looked like a tactical maneuver. "I made a mistake, Mark. I was having a breakdown. I didn't know what I was doing. I was sick." She took a step forward, expecting him to step back, to usher her in out of the rain as he had done for 12 years. But Mark remained planted, his hand gripping the doorframe. "You weren't sick when you forged my signature," he said. "You weren't sick when you emptied the college fund. You were efficient." "I was lost." Her voice rose, cracking with a desperate edge. "You were always working. The house was so big, and I felt so small. Julian." He listened. He made me feel seen. But it was a lie. I see that now. I just want to come home. She reached out, her hand trembling, reaching for his arm. Mark stepped back, not to let her in, but to avoid her touch. The repulsion was physical. "There is no home here for you, Elena," he said. "You burned it." "But Leo," she choked out. "He's my son. You can't." "Mark, I need to see him. Does he know I'm here?" She tried to look past him, toward the stairs. "Leo, Mommy's home." "Stop," Mark hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare wake him." "He loves me," she said, her face hardening, the mask of the victim slipping to reveal the entitlement underneath. "He understands me. He helped me, remember? He wants me to be happy. You can't keep him from me. I'm his mother." "You were his mother," Mark said. "Now, you're a cautionary tale." He saw the shift in her eyes. The desperation was replaced by a cold calculation. She scanned the hallway, looking at the missing rug, the empty spot where the painting used to be. She was assessing his weakness, gauging how much fight he had left. "I have rights," she said, straightening her spine, pulling the thin coat tighter around herself. "I'll get a lawyer. I'll tell them you forced me out. I'll tell them you were abusive." "Go ahead," Mark said. "I have the photos, Elena. I have the bank records. And I have a son who remembers exactly what you told him before you left him to save yourself." He began to close the door. "Mark, please," she said, throwing her weight against the wood, her voice dropping to a whimper. "I have nowhere to go. I have no money." "You spent it," Mark said. All $200,000 of it. He shut the door. He turned the deadbolt. He engaged the security chain. He stood in the hallway, listening to her sobbing on the other side. It was a loud, theatrical sound, meant to penetrate the walls, meant to wake the boy upstairs. Mark leaned his head against the wood, waiting for the silence to return. He knew this wasn't the end. The sobbing would stop, and the war would begin. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne. It was a neutral ground that felt anything but neutral. Mark sat on one side of the long mahogany table, his hands clasped tightly together to hide the tremor that had returned. Beside him, his attorney, Robert, arranged a stack of files with methodical slowness. On the other side sat Elena. She had shed the desperate look from the rainy doorstep. Today, she was wearing a modest navy blouse and a cardigan that made her look soft, maternal, and fragile. She looked at the table, refusing to meet Mark's eyes, playing the role of the intimidated wife to perfection. Beside her was her lawyer, a man named Kerrigan who had a reputation for turning divorce cases into scorched earth campaigns. "We are not here to rehash the past," Kerrigan began, his voice smooth and oily. "We are here to discuss a fair, equitable distribution and a visitation schedule for the minor child, Leo." "There is no distribution," Robert said, his tone dry. "Your client liquidated the marital assets. The distribution happened the night she left with a bag of cash." Kerrigan smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes. "That money was used for living expenses during a separation caused by extreme emotional duress. A duress caused by Mr. Anderson's controlling behavior. But we are willing to overlook the emotional damages." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "My client is willing to settle for a one-time payment of $50,000 and weekends with Leo. In exchange, she will sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding Mr. Anderson's business practices." Mark stiffened. "My business practices?" "Elena has shared some concerning details," Kerrigan said, leaning back. "Conversations she overheard about zoning permits, bribes to city inspectors to expedite the Hudson project. Things that, if made public, would trigger an immediate ethics investigation into your firm." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But in architecture, a reputation took decades to build and one headline to destroy. An investigation, even if he was cleared, would freeze his current projects. It would bankrupt the firm. "This is extortion," Mark said, his voice low. "This is a settlement," Kerrigan corrected. "A clean break. You write the check, she signs the papers, you keep the house, she gets weekends, everyone moves on." The room went silent. The hum of the ventilation system seemed deafening. Mark looked at the checkbook inside his jacket pocket. $50,000. He could borrow it. He could take a loan against the firm. It would hurt, but it would be over. No court dates. No public dragging of his name. No terrifying risk of losing his license. He could make Elena go away, just like he solved problems on a construction site, by throwing money at the structural failure until it held. He looked at Elena. She was finally looking at him. Her eyes were pleading, but there was a glint of triumph in them. She knew him. She knew he was pragmatic. She knew he hated mess. She was banking on him being the machine she had told Leo he was. If he paid her, he was buying peace. But he was also buying into her narrative. He would be teaching Leo that truth is negotiable. He would be teaching his son that if you hurt people deeply enough, You get paid for it. Mark thought of Leo sitting on the floor, saying, "She told me to go back to bed." Leo had carried the weight of the truth for 6 months. Mark couldn't pay to make the truth convenient now. Mark stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, shattering the quiet tension. "No," Mark said. Elena flinched. Kerrigan's smile faltered. "Mr. Anderson, I strongly suggest you consider the ramifications." "I have considered them," Mark said, his voice steady for the first time in months. "Publish your lies. Call the ethics board. Call the newspapers. I will open my books to anyone who wants to see them. But I will not pay you a single cent for abandoning our son." He looked directly at Elena. "You wanted to trade our life for a check. You already did that. You don't get to do it twice." He turned to Robert. "We're done here. File for the court date." "Mark," Elena said, her voice sharp, the maternal mask slipping. "You're making a mistake. You're going to lose everything." "I already lost the only thing that mattered," Mark said, walking to the door. "Now I'm just cleaning up the mess." He walked out of the conference room, leaving the offer on the table. He felt lighter than he had in years. The fear was still there, but the shame was gone. The gavel didn't make a loud bang like it did in the movies. It was a dull thud, a wooden punctuation mark that ended 12 years of marriage. The judge's ruling had been clinical and blistering. The evidence of financial misconduct, the burner phone, the tracking of the college fund, the maxed-out credit lines, had stripped Elena of her victim narrative. She had left the courtroom not in handcuffs, but in something worse: total irrelevance. She walked out with no alimony, no custody, and a court order to repay half the debt she had accrued. Mark never looked back at her. He just took Leo's hand and walked out into the gray afternoon. 2 weeks later, the house in Queen Anne was empty. The echo in the hallway was different now. It wasn't the heavy silence of secrets. It was just the physics of an empty space. Mark had sold it to a young tech couple from California who looked at the high ceilings and saw potential, not ghosts. The sale covered the mortgage and the majority of the debts Elena had left behind. "Dad?" Mark turned. Leo was standing by the front door, holding a single box. It was labeled "Leo's Room, Keep." It was surprisingly small. "Ready, bud?" Mark asked. "Yeah," Leo said. He looked around the foyer one last time. "I don't think I'll miss it. It was always cold in here." They drove the U-Haul across the city to a 2-bedroom apartment in Ballard. It was a 3rd-floor walk-up, smelling of floor wax and old timber. It was a fraction of the size of their old house. The kitchen was a galley, tight and functional. The living room had a view of a brick wall and a sliver of the street below. But as they unpacked, the space filled up quickly. It felt dense, warm. They ordered takeout, Thai food this time, not cheap pizza, and sat on the floor among the boxes. The wind rattled the window pane, a sound that used to make Mark worry about roof tiles. Now, it was just weather. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a single, crisp $1 bill. "Leo," Mark said, clearing a space on the coffee table. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a clean mason jar they had used for the move. He placed the jar on the table and dropped the dollar bill inside. It fluttered to the bottom, looking lonely against the glass. "What's that?" Leo asked, chewing on a spring roll. "That," Mark said, pointing to the jar, "is the college fund." Leo stopped chewing. He looked at the jar, then at his father. His eyes widened slightly. "It's $1. It's a start," Mark corrected, And this time it's real. No secrets, no side accounts. Every dollar that goes in there you'll know about. We build it together. Even if it takes 10 years, even if we have to work weekends, we do it honest. Leo put his food down. He reached into the pocket of his jeans. Mark watched, curious. Leo pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, allowance money he had saved from weeks ago. Without saying a word, Leo leaned forward and dropped the $5 into the jar. It landed on top of Mark's one. $6, Leo said. A small, genuine smile broke across his face. The first real smile Mark had seen since the night of the rain. That's enough for a notebook, maybe. Mark felt a lump in his throat, tight and painful, but it was a good pain. It was the ache of healing. The perfect life was gone, incinerated by lies and greed. But the structural integrity of what remained, this small apartment, this jar, this boy, was stronger than anything he had designed as an architect. Yeah, Mark whispered, ruffling his son's hair. It's enough. Outside, the city lights of Seattle flickered on, indifferent to their story. But inside the apartment, the air was clear. The debt was paid. The foundation was poured. And for the first time in a long time, the balance was positive.